I'm Dean Temple, a Ukrainian-American actor, writer, and creative director, and the curator of the Fertile Ground film series. The Ukrainian Institute of America asked me to organize this program, and I saw an opportunity not just to expose the Western audience to the excellent films made by Ukrainian directors, but also to create a forum for contemporary Ukrainian voices, to give short talks that add context for our audience. I couldn't have done this without Nadia Parfen and TalkFlix.com, which is a Ukrainian streaming service that makes it possible for you to watch Ukrainian films at home. I also want to thank the Ukrainian Spaces podcast for both their inspiration and their guidance as we prepared Fertile Ground for this inaugural year. For our first film in this series, My Thoughts Are Silent, directed by Antonio Lukic, our speaker was Volodymyr Yermolenko, philosopher, educator, writer, and editor-in-chief of Ukraine World. He's appeared in The Economist, The Financial Times, has been a guest on The Ezra Klein Show, and has been instrumental in collecting stories of witness throughout this year. This is his talk and our conversation.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to talk with you, although I don't see you, but I assume you're there, and we kind of accustomed to talk with screens right now, but it always always feel like a bit of amputated. But let's try to discuss. So I guess you were looking at the film My Thoughts Are Silent, and I will just start with the fact that, with an idea that everything you see in this film might sound and might look very weird and maybe even a little bit freaky, but that's a very realistic film. And I think one of the things that Ukrainians are coming through in the past decades, and especially during the war, which started in 2014 and which has turned into such an ugly and large-scale war in February this year, something that we learn is that reality is always bigger, more interesting, more sometimes absurd, more surreal even than any kind of fiction. And this is, I think, a very interesting trait of the Ukrainian culture, the filmmaking, literature, visual arts, philosophy. I'm a philosopher, so I'm supposed to be in a very abstract thinking, as philosophers are, be a university professor who is making philosophy out of his or her cabinet, which I actually am. I have a cabinet, and I am a university teacher as well. But at the same time, I'm traveling a lot across Ukraine. I'm talking to people a lot. We're doing volunteer work. We're going to the front line. We're buying cars for our defenders and some other equipment. And it shows how Ukraine is now a big organism where every individual is an individual with his or her traits, idiosyncrasies, interests, etc. But at the same time, a part of a big collective body, kind of a cell in a blood flow. And I think this is a very important thing about Ukraine right now. So as the main character in this movie, Ukrainians dream a lot. And Ukrainians maybe contrast with the reality that we are facing, sometimes not a very pleasant reality. I mean, that reality that we had before the war, before 2014. And now the reality which is very tragic, which is sometimes heroic, and which is sometimes unbearable in terms of suffering. Just this morning, you probably have seen in the news, there was a missile attack on Zaporizhia, and according to latest information, we have 20 people dead and about 90 people wounded. And this is the reality which is unbearable sometimes. But if you ask me to define Ukrainians in one word, I would say that this is a nation of despite, a nation which develops in despite of something, in despite of big obstacles, in despite of this very cruel reality sometimes. And Ukrainians have succeeded to maintain their culture despite the repressions that we had in Russian Empire and Soviet Union. Ukrainians maintained their language despite the fact that it was declared as non-existent. Ukrainians had a few cultural renaissance in the 19th century, in early 20th century. All of them were executed. We now have another renaissance, and I think we should read current Russian war against Ukraine as an attempt to repeat the execution of the Ukrainian nationhood and Ukrainian culture. In this sense, there are lots of parallels that we see with 1930s, for example. Therefore, we interpret this reality as a kind of coming back of I would say, a simulacrum of Stalinism, not a real Stalinism, but a simulacrum of Stalinism. But this development, despite so many obstacles, is something very interesting. Also, this character in the movie you see that he is very creative in his attempts to reach some maybe very freaky dream. And this creativity is also something that characterizes Ukrainians today. And this is an interesting, very interesting question. Why? Why this spark of creativity we have during several Maidan revolutions, during this war, during the way how Ukrainians organize protests, during the way how Ukrainians organize the restaurant culture right now in cities like Kyiv or Lviv or many others. And I think this is very, very interesting how the society responds to this very big suffering and very big problems with the kind of creativity and with the kind of will of life. I'm now wearing a T-shirt Kharkiv, about Kharkiv, and that's not accidental, because we are visiting Kharkiv quite often, and we will come back to this city next week. And I'm just astonished and fascinated with Kharkiv, because this city is second largest Ukrainian city, is 40 kilometers from the Russian border. It is shelled practically every day, not only with missiles, but with artillery. And despite all that, we had a remarkable boom of culture there. There is our great writer and poet Serhiy Zhadan, which many people in Ukraine actually hoped he will get a Nobel Prize of Literature this year. And the only reason that he didn't get this Nobel Prize, I think, is that he is still too young. So he's, I think, about 50. And that's kind of a message to him that you guys need to live and work for many, many decades to come. And after that, we will give you a Nobel Prize. And like all this organization that he made of rock concerts in the metro, or recently, 2 weeks ago, they had the literature festival, in which we, with my wife, we participated, unfortunately online, because we got COVID. But imagine the real offline literature festival and intellectual festival with very deep discussions in a hidden place. The place was not announced because, for obvious reasons, because it cannot be public. And in the major cities of Ukraine, public events are not. Really information about it is disclosed secretly among the initiated. But this is it. The cultural life is developing, is interesting, is booming, and there are theater plays, there are rock concerts, there are poetry festivals, etc. So this is very interesting, and this is really kind of a response of life towards this world of death, which is now brought by the Putinist regime. The second thing I would like to focus is the role of ordinary people. Or I would say that I don't really like the word heroism. I think we need to kind of, it's certainly not in the way as I perceive it in the spirit of the 19th century or something like that. But it doesn't mean that I devalue this word. I do think that there are lots of heroes around us, but heroes are ordinary people who do extraordinary things. And I think this is something that they're not superhumans. They're not like these medieval knights which are fighting against the dragons. Sometimes people on the front line, people who rescue people from the shellings, people who are volunteering and supplying the army in enormous quantities. These people who were experiencing the occupation, people who were evacuating civilians during shelling, these people are often ordinary people who are doing extraordinary things. I remember the director of the cultural house in a town near Kyiv, which is called Makariv, which experienced heavy fights in February and March. And she's an ordinary woman who is directing the so-called cultural house, which we have in all Ukrainian towns. It's a kind of a Soviet legacy. It's a big building in which people are normally going to dance classes or music classes, and in which there are sometimes performances on the public holidays. And she was organizing a bomb shelter there. Then there is a bomb that fell on this house, and the second floor destroyed the second floor. People continued to hide in the bomb shelter. And then she organized an evacuation of civilians without knowing anything about this, going into her private car, looking for buses, looking for 20-year boys who would drive these buses without even permits, and under shelling, under constant shelling. I remember the head of one village which we visited, also near Kyiv, who, when we asked him why didn't he leave this village, although 80% of the village dwellers have left the village knowing that the village will be occupied by the Russians. And he said, I will never leave my people. And this is something that we witness all the time in our travels. People say, well, I will never leave my people, like the so-called starostas of the villages. And I think that this is a very remarkable thing. This is something that we need to understand in Ukraine, that many things are actually decided not by the leaders, by the political leaders, but really by ordinary people on the ground. And if you look back into the Ukrainian cultural tradition, intellectual tradition, you will see that the key word for Ukrainian political philosophy is the word hromada, which means community. It's not the word state, it's not the word держава, it's not the word imperium, it's not the word grandeur, величие, as is for Russians. It's not the word государь, as in Russian culture, meaning the sovereign or the Tsar. It's the word hromada, community. This is the word which was developed by key Ukrainian intellectuals like Mikhail Drahomanov in 19th century. And they were absolutely right, because they were seeing Ukrainian politics. It is not only Ukrainian politics. I mean, I think every sound politics, it should be structured like this, as a kind of self-organization of people who established a organized community, which will develop into kind of a community of communities, as Drahomanov called it, which will be a state. And then these states, as larger communities, will organize into communities of communities of communities, and then you will have a bigger structures, federations, or something like the European Union in the 20th century, or something like the United States. And I think it's very interesting how this is really deep in the Ukrainian society, that citizens are mostly disidentify themselves with the leader, so they kind of oppose themselves to the leader, but they feel that they have strength in them. They have strength as citizens, as communities, and I think that the best thing to talk about Ukraine, and again maybe many other countries who are experiencing some dramatic events, is really to talk about this personal experience, about the stories that are happening on the ground, on specific places, on specific villages. And this is something we are doing a lot in Ukraine World. If you look at our website, ukraineworld.org, you will see a special chapter which is called Stories. If you look at our podcast Explaining Ukraine, you will see that we do a lot of, with my wife, Tatiana Harkova, we do a lot of just talks about the places we visited, about Motyzhin, about Makariv, about Chernihiv, about Kharkiv, about villages near Kyiv, about Moshchun, a very dramatic village, who actually has places where out of hundreds of houses, nothing has survived and nothing is intact. But we can actually say that this village saved Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, one of those villages that saved Kyiv. And so I think this is something which is probably the most important thing in the current Ukraine. And the last thing I would like to say is that the role of the cultural actors, of writers, of artists has also changed. I think all of us perceive ourselves as primarily citizens of Ukraine. If you ask us what is your profession, we'll tell you that we are citizens of Ukraine. Many people have gone to the front line without, having any previous education of being militaries. There are fantastic Ukrainian writers who are on the front line, including women like my student Yarina Chernohus, or very talented writers like Artem Chekh or Artem Chapai, Artem Polizhak, all Artems, by the way, and cinema directors like Oleg Sentsov or Akhtem Seitablaev, and painters, director of Ukrainian National Memory Institute, journalists like Pavlo Kazarin or Vakhtan Kipiani. Many of them are actually on the front line. Others like me, I didn't go to the front line. Maybe I should add yet, but this is currently the reality. We're trying to do much work to help the front line, to help our soldiers, to collect money, to buy necessary equipment, to go there quite often. And again, this repeats my initial thought is that we are all like parts of this big organism, and that doesn't mean that we erase our individualities or that we perceive ourselves as only the cells of the body. We are the cells of the body, but that doesn't mean that we erase our individuality. This is kind of a harmony between the two. And this is something which is present in this very word of Hromada, which is so important for me, because Hromada is a community of people which lets you be individual, but at the same time, which tells you that there is something bigger than you. And for example, your community can be something that, as Vinnychenko, a Ukrainian writer and politician, 1 century ago said, the name of his novella is something bigger than us. So I will stop here, and I have these 20 minutes, and I will try to be laconic, and I will be happy to hear your questions.
Now, Lydia has note cards that can be handed out to people. Did she hand them out to you? Oh, there she is. Okay. She'll hand them out to you. If you could write your questions down, I'll ask over here, so it'll be easier to hear. In the meantime, I do have some questions. One of them is in reference to what you talked about. Oh, I guess I should be on the mic so people can hear me. This mic, this mic. In reference to one of the things you talked about not being at the front line at the moment, it seems like part of the front line that Ukraine is facing in this war is actually cultural preservation. That there's a front in maintaining, in promoting, and continuing to develop the culture of the country, since that specifically is something that is under attack in this this war is an existential war for Ukraine's identity. And so it seems to me that there's another front entirely that doesn't involve arms, but that involves culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. But when I say frontline, I mean exactly one thing. Is the frontline is where you risk your life. That should be a clear distinction, and therefore, of course, people who risk their lives are. I don't think we should use the same word. Therefore, I don't like the word information front. I think I'm doing a lot of work, and we at Ukraine World. At information, we're really telling a lot about Ukraine in English and in other languages, in German, in Italian. We will also soon launch versions in French, in Spanish. But this is for me a very important information field. I think we are trying to fill many gaps in terms of understanding of the current events, but also in terms of understanding of the background. Since 24th of February, we recorded 75 episodes of the Explaining Ukraine podcast. So sometimes people tell us that this is crazy, but 75 episodes, that means 75 hours, or maybe a bit less, maybe 60 hours of information about the current events, but also about the background. What is Ukrainian culture? What is Ukrainian history? What is our relations with Russian culture? What is our relations with Europe, etc. And I think this is really important work. Therefore, I'm staying in this field because I think this is useful, and the key motivation for us is being useful. Maybe we're just more useful here, but I would not use the word frontline because, again, well, we can say that we are all risking our lives by staying in Ukraine, by going to dangerous places, but let's also not overestimate. And unfortunately, I have some friends who are already killed. And I understand that when I open Facebook, quite probably I will find a message in which I will hear the obituary, the necrology of a person whom I know, or even my friend, or a person who is known by my friends. And this is, again, the war is not only about, maybe not specifically about victories and heroism, and this is all very important, and we all believe that Ukraine will win. We're doing a lot for this, everybody, but we should also understand that the war is about the loss of human lives, and in many cases it's the best who are gone. It's the best people, those who volunteered for the front line, those who are and this is all very tragic. Coming back to culture, I do think that we need to work a lot, and writers should find the way and time to write, not for self-expression, but for documenting, for finding words for this. And this is also very difficult for a country at war, because if you look at Ukrainian history, it's full of suffering. It's full of, in the 20th century, well, everybody knows Tim Snyder's book Bloodlands, I guess, about Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland between 33 and 45. And the problem is that Ukrainian culture is not that much known in the world, because it was kind of brought to silence in many ways for two reasons. The first reason is that it was just impossible to talk about this. The horrifying stories were so big that you just keep silent. You just don't talk about this. And when we sometimes reproached the Ukrainians that we don't talk about the past, we didn't do our homework with the Holocaust, with Holocaust memory, we didn't do even our homework with Holodomor memory. I think that explains by the fact that this trauma was so big that the only possible reaction was silence. Because how you can talk about massive deaths. I mean, what words can you find for this? You just lose any words. Another reason is, of course, people who tried to talk were silenced physically and by violence, primarily by Soviet repressions. There was nobody who could talk about Holodomor after 32, 33 among writers, because everybody was just killed, sent to camps and then killed. By 1937, there were nobody. So I think we should really kind of break this vicious circle, and we should talk with culture, with arts, with literature, with philosophy. But then you are in this dilemma that you should talk about something you are unable to talk, and you need some. I mean, it's easy to make a movie about the war 50 years afterwards. I think it's easy to write a magical story about the war, magical realism about the war after 100 years. It's very difficult to write when it's going on, and when the people you want to describe are your friends who were killed. So we should follow this and see and well, many writers try to do something, try to write something. We will see whether in the cinema there will be some big movies. But I think this is kind of you are in this dilemma between understanding that words about these atrocities are actually a blasphemy and a duty. It's a blasphemy because no word can match the reality, and it's a duty because you cannot be silent, because if you are silent, the evil will go farther. That's what happened in Ukrainian history, is that the evil which was not described properly, on time, timely, it just was unpunished. And one of the interpretations of the current war is that this is that recurrence of the unpunished evil. These war crimes or genocide, how you call it, is not one-off event. It's a repeated genocide. It's something that repeats the story of the 30s. It's something that repeats the story of this 18th century when Ukrainian autonomy, Cossack autonomy, was destroyed. It's something that repeats the story of Russian Muscovy army in Baturin in early 18th century. And I think this is a big task for us to tell this story.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, in looking at that, because Germany did have to reconcile with the crimes they committed in the 30s and 40s. The Soviet Union never had to, and the Russian Empire never had to. So what you're talking about specifically, and you talked about this in an episode of Explaining Ukraine several weeks ago, about crime and punishment versus crime with no punishment. And that's a fascinating discussion to go back and listen to for everybody in the room. I do have some questions from people in the room. We're all sorry for your losses. I know every day I tune into social media, another Ukrainian colleague has someone they care about who is gone. So I have this first question from the floor here. If you could talk about transition in the past several generations from more tribal history towards today's more unified Ukrainian population, and whether the establishment of universities like Kyiv Mohyla Academy has aided in that evolution.
Well, I would not use the word tribal. I think it's not the right word. I think well, Ukraine is a multicultural country and multinational.
Well, if I can clarify that, when we're talking about tribalism in the West, quite often we're talking about opposite sides of a political divide. So people who are in disagreement with each other as opposed to necessarily ethnic diversity. So like the notorious Western-Eastern divide between Ukrainians. I think, is that correct with regard to that question? Yes. Oh yeah, I think it's more along the lines of tribalism as a divide, but sorry to interrupt, please go ahead.
Right. that makes it a little bit more clear. So I think different societies have different time periods, and I remember discussion in the late 2000s when we were like discussing Ukraine and other countries, our neighbors, and one of the theses was that look at Poland, how unified Poland is, how decisive it was in joining the European Union, in joining NATO. There was a consensus about this, and the problem of Ukraine was that there was no consensus, not even about NATO enlargement, not NATO accession, but about EU. And if you take the late 2000s, you would have a situation when 30% were for EU integration, 30% were for integration with Russia, and 30% were undefined. Approximately that NATO accession was supported by, I think, 14 or 20%, and things change, because if we look at Poland, this highly divided society is a country in many ways divided in two. I don't know how you perceive your history in the US recently, but my guess is that in the 90s, for example, when you had this kind of euphoria maybe about the end of the Cold War, actually the victory in the Cold War, the society was united. Whereas what I hear now about America is that you have a deeply divided society. And we can talk about the same about maybe Britain during Brexit, maybe about France. And actually, it would be also the case of Russia if this opposition was not expelled, exterminated, and actually almost deported. Ukraine, interestingly, was going from these divisions into much more unity. And interestingly, that Russians helped it a lot, because even Maidan of 2013, 2014, it was a very unifying event, but only for parts of the population. I think, according to sociology, only 50% of the Ukrainians in 2014 fully supported Maidan. Doesn't mean that 50% opposed it. I think it was like 25 or something, and then again 25 or 20 were undefined. But what united Ukrainians much more is, of course, Russian aggression in 2014. People even with kind of pro-Soviet views, people from elder generations, and I'm talking about some of my relatives, for them, who could have an ambiguous attitude towards Euromaidan and the Revolution of Dignity, for them, of course, Crimea annexation and then military invasion of Eastern Ukraine was a shock. And this led to a situation when in 2022 or 2020, when we were doing with partners sociological researches, focus groups, we understood that the citizens who were, for example, in Eastern Southern Ukraine, who would probably be more pro-Russian, are not pro-Russian at all, despite the fact that they were still in the Russian cultural space. So they would not know anything about Ukrainian literature. They would know and only about Russian literature. They would continue to speak Russian language. They would be very skeptical about the West, by the way. They would they would have this zero-sum worldview, thinking that if the West helps Ukraine, that means that the West has some pragmatic interest about it. They were not thinking in terms of values. They were only thinking in terms of interests. And I think that had a worldview which is quite similar to the worldview of many emerging countries right now, who are like in Asia or in some other regions of the world, who are actually very pragmatic right now, and sometimes even very cynical. And when Europe or America are talking about values, they're very cynical about it, because they're saying, okay, you're imperialists, what do you know about values over there? So I think this was the worldview among many people, and it's not what I think, it's confirmed by the sociology. So they're not pro-Russian, but they were vulnerable to some propaganda which were coming from Russia, primarily anti-Western, anti-European, anti-American propaganda. And Russians knew that very well. And their propaganda was working like, they're not saying that Russian is good, they would be saying that Europe is bad and America is bad. That's what was the key argument. And that means that if you ask those people, those skeptics, it didn't mean that there were no pro-Russian segment in the society, let's say in 2020, it was, but it was around 10%. It didn't coincide with the ratings of the pro-Russian parties, like led by Medvedchuk, who is now exchanged for Ukrainian defenders, and he's in Russia, who was a clear Russian spy, Russian agent, who was working on Russian money. But the TV channels of Medvedchuk were promoting rather this anti-Western idea than pro-Russian idea, because they understood that they could not promote pro-Russian idea. I mean, nobody is already would say that I want to be with Russia. I mean, only about maybe 9%, 10%. And these were mostly aged people who were, of course, naturally will be less and less in the coming years. And then Russians did a fantastic thing. They launched this full-scale invasion, and they started bombing Russian-speaking cities like Kharkiv, like Mykolaiv, destroying Russian-speaking cities, like mostly Russian-speaking cities like Mariupol or others. So they are basically waging, the people who suffered the most from this war are people whom Russians pretend to defend. And we have seen this strategy in every other Russian war, in Chechen war, the destruction of Grozny, in the Syrian war, the destruction of Aleppo, total destruction, attacks on civilians. But then, I mean, in those wars, in the Chechen war, also ethnic Russians were suffering from this, who were in Grozny, but as we told by the reporters. But at least in those wars, they could say, okay, these are completely other people, Chechens and Syrians, and we don't care about them. We will bomb them, we will annihilate them, as Joseph Conrad's character, Mr. Kurz, says, exterminate all the brutes. I think that's the ideology of the Russian world currently, of the Russian ideology, Russian war. But can they say the same about Kharkiv people in Kharkiv, Russian speakers? They say the same about Izum, in which we have a mass grave right now, over 400 deaths, who are, I think, 90% are Russian speakers. Can we say the same about Mariupol? So currently, Russia is going into the deep cynicism of its own existence. It actually exterminates people it declares that it wants to defend. And of course, Ukrainians understand this. Ukrainians understand this, and that doesn't make people in Zaporizhzhia, in Kharkiv, in Dnipro, in Odessa to turn into Ukrainian language very quickly. Most of the cities continue to be Russian-speaking. Most of the refugees from these cities continue to speak Russian. And maybe they will not open up a Ukrainian culture for them very quickly. Maybe they will continue to have a kind of a post-colonial view and post-colonial worldview, but they will certainly not people who would say, I want to be with Russia, I want the Russian world.
Right. That's interesting. How are you for time? Do you have time for one more question?
Yes.
I have one more question here that is asking actually about what you think of the current state of the Ukrainian film industry and how you see the war affecting it. And I know you sort of mentioned that very briefly, but if you have a deeper opinion on what the impact of this war could be on the Ukrainian film industry.
Look, I'm not a specialist in film industry, so I cannot really comment it professionally. I know several film directors whom I admire. I admire Akhtem Seytablayev, whom I mentioned, and I met him once. I admire Nariman Aliyev, whom I met yesterday, and we drink wine together and discussed many interesting things. I really advise his movie about Crimean Tatars and how they try to bring a killed Crimean Tatar, the member of the family, back to Crimea to bury him in their land. This is very touching movie in which Seyit Ablayev plays a major character, by the way. I admire Irina Tsilik, who is a fantastic writer and film director who won the Sundance Film Festival. And this is an incredible family. Her husband, Artem Chekh, a very talented writer who is now on the front line. I admire, of course, Oleg Sentsov. So many people of this kind, but I'm not a specialist in that. I just only an amateur who's watching the movies. And what strikes me is how talented they are, how incredible they just did. Like Nariman Aliyev, I think it was his first big film, and with Irina Tsilik, this the land is blue like an orange. It's also her first big film documentary. Now she releases her second film. So, and from the first films, they're so genius. I mean, so remarkable. And with the film that you have seen, I think it's the same story. So that means that, or take Slavoshpitsky's film Tribe, Plemia, about the deaf, the world of the deaf people. So it's remarkable how talented these people are, with no big instruction, with no big actually with inexisting industry. They come to the sector with such powerful things, and I think the key thing that explains it, there are two things that explains it. First is that there are a huge number of talented people in Ukraine, not only film directors, but also actors, but also all the people around, scenarists. But second, that the reality is so rich in stories that it just falls on you, and you just tell the story and you know how to do it. Unfortunately, we have big problems with the way how institutions are organized, how the state runs all this, and it's still very problematic. But again, I'm not an insider to go into detail. What I know is that Ukrainian institutions could have been much more efficient in supporting this independent film industry. But at the same time, as I said, Ukrainian culture is interesting because in all these 30 years, it would rather develop against the obstacles of imposed sometimes by the states, post-Soviet states, and with no real support, and by itself. And maybe this is also one of the interesting ways to develop, because that means that these really talented people are actually going to the and showing their talent in a perfect